All right, this is our fourth installment of the Apologetics series, and today we're going to talk about the cosmological argument. I was going to talk about the cosmological argument and then go into the argument from design, but instead I think I'm going to save this as kind of a part A, part B thing in discussing classical apologetics. Um, the classical apologetics, obviously, they're more abundant than just the cosmological or argument from design, but I think these are the two really more important arguments in within classical apologetics. Obviously, there are things like the ontological argument, there's moral argument, there's things like that. But ultimately, I want to deal with these because I think that I think they hold a lot of weight. And so, in discussing the cosmological argument, I really want to discuss William Lane Craig's kind of version of that, which is the Kalam argument. And the Kalam argument simply states it's very simple. You can even memorize it yourself. Um, Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, this is fleshed out. It's not just left there. There's a lot more to it than that. But essentially, those are the three, the two premises, and then you have the conclusion there. Um, Now, you might have someone object and say, well, I think that the universe is eternal. But there are both logical and scientific reasons today that we would just say, well, that's probably not true. Craig gives often an argument from infinite regression, meaning that ultimately you can't have an infinite uh, series of things, like an infinite amount of time or an infinite, like, something that's existing infinitely within time. And so the universe would have to be outside of time, and yet we know the universe is not outside of time. It's actually within time. It's conducting itself according to time and all of that. Um, and his argument obviously is going to be a lot better than mine. I'm not a philosopher, obviously. And so if you want the fuller, probably more accurate version of that argument, then I would turn on one of his videos when he's discussing the Kalam argument, and you'd probably get frankly a better explanation of it than I'm going to give you here. So what's interesting is that in this argument, then he expands it by saying, look, so whatever existed prior to the universe to cause the universe, it couldn't be just merely a state of things. In other words, it couldn't be simply that there are simply laws that are eternal that exist in that state that then brought about a particular effect. Because in fact, if it was eternally that way, that it brought about this particular effect because it was in this state, then it would have eternally brought about the universe. And yet the universe is finite. The universe obviously had a beginning. And so at that point, we have to then say, well, it couldn't just be a state of things then. It's not some sort of energy that is, again, it can't be something that's changing energy or whatever by itself. If you think of it this way, if the state, let's say the law or the state of the pre-universe was that everything was at freezing, and it needed to, like, let's say, unfreeze water or something, even though you'd have to ask where the water came from. But let's say it had to unfreeze the water. Well, if it was always eternally, infinitely in this state of freezing, there's nothing to then make the change to unfreeze the water. And so, in that same regard, you can't simply have like energy that you have to have a mind that's doing it. You have to have a mind that says, okay, I'm going to bring about a change. So there was no universe before. I'm going to now bring about a change and make a universe. And in that regard, you have to have a personal being that's creating the universe. You can't just have energy, can't just have laws that are infinite, because again, they're unchanging, they're the same. It's like a machine just doing the same thing that never breaks, never does anything else. Well, it would just bring about the same effect from all eternity. So why isn't the universe eternal then? And yet we know that it's not. And so ultimately, the idea is that you need a personal being. This personal being is not using like some material thing to make the universe, because there's nothing material. That's all part of the universe. And so this eternal, or this being, this uncaused being, has to bring about this caused universe, and he has to do it actually from thought, not through something material. And that means that he must be all powerful. He's able to actually like think it and speak it, and it comes into existence. That's the cause of the universe. That's what makes sense in terms of what brings about this universe. Now, I've seen multiple objections that people try to make against this argument, and either they misunderstand it, which that's the most common thing that occurs, is they simply misunderstand the argument, or they go into this absurdity to argue something like, well, the universe doesn't have a cause, even though it began. Well, again, that's to argue that you have being from non-being, which, I mean, goes back to ancient times, ancient philosophy, where the principle is laid down, the metaphysical principle, that you cannot get being from non-being. That just makes sense. And some people will argue that, well, everything we observe that has a beginning, though, has a material cause, and therefore, you could argue that, but God isn't a material cause, and therefore I can refute it that way. The problem is that that's not essential to causation. We know that if something came into being, if something has being, and that being began at some point, there was a point when that being did not exist. In other words, the point that the universe, for instance, did not exist. Then ultimately, you have to have something cause it to exist. And if you argue that there's no cause for it, you're not really making an argument. You're just saying it is because it is, and I have no explanation. That's all you're really saying. And some people are willing to just say that. They're just willing to say it doesn't function like anything else we know begins to exist. As I said before, you don't need a material cause. You just simply have to have some sort of cause from something that's being to being. You can't have non-being to being. You can't have non-existence to existence. And so there's got to be something that exists in order to cause that existence. Now, if you're going to turn around and say, well, that everything else has all these other components to it, and you're just reducing it, I would say, well, yeah. I mean, every tiger has to have another tiger to produce it when it comes into being. That doesn't mean everything that exists has to have a tiger preceding it, or every human has to have a human, every tree has to have a tree, or a nut, or something. I mean, every chicken needs an egg, or whatever you want to say. But the point is that you have to have something in order from something to come forth from it. The principle is not you have to have a chicken for something to come forth from it, or the tiger, or a human, or a tree. In other words, it doesn't have to be specific. You simply need an effectual causation of something. So in other words, something that can cause something is needed to cause something to exist. Something that can cause something to exist is needed to cause something to exist. Now, the point then would be is that that's not a disqualifier to say, oh, well, there are these other things that we experience within our, empirical verification of how things come to exist. You don't have to tack on all those things. You simply need to say all things that exist, regardless, need some sort of effectual cause. And I would also argue that actually everything that exists, let's just look at the realm of the things that we make. All right. So obviously it would beg the question to say that, well, everything exists is done so because it has thought behind it, because obviously that we see trees create trees and all that sort of thing. But what I would say is that you're watching me on a camera right now made by humans, and a microphone made by humans, and all this furniture made by humans and whatnot. And you might be tempted to say, well, everything has a material cause because we had to make those things out of material, and we had to use our hands and all of that, and we're material and all of that. But ultimately, that's not true. Actually, everything that exists is created from thought that we've made. Everything we've made is created from thought. We think it. Now, we're not able to effectually cause the existence of something from thought to its existence. We can't merely speak it and it comes into existence. We're not able to do that. But so we use the material as a medium, but it actually comes from thought first. Without the thought, there is no effectual cause. You don't just start making stuff with your hands. Even that would take thought. If you're just randomly working with your hands and you end up with a camera or something, it's still taking you to think through it. And of course, the things that we've made, we've thought of them and we've created them in that way. Now, that's not a perfect analogy. You might be able to think of something that we didn't think of or whatever. But for the most part, most of the things, if not all, that we have made come from thought. And we simply have a medium of the material. I would say the same thing when it comes to the cosmological argument. I would say ultimately, you don't need a material cause. You just need a metaphysical cause that's effectual. In other words, you need a metaphysical cause that is powerful enough to when that metaphysical cause has a mind, is an actual agent of causation that can affect it by merely doing something like thinking or saying it and calling it into existence. And of course, that's what we're actually saying happened with the universe. And that's all that really could have happened with the universe with its causation, because if nothing material existed before the universe, the answer isn't, oh, well, therefore there's no cause. The answer would automatically be then its causation must be metaphysical in nature and not material, which then would prove the existence of an all-powerful personal being bringing it into existence. Again, personal because it can't be just energy or a state of affairs or whatever it may be. It has to be a personal being with a mind calling it into existence, able to change the state of affairs through his own agency, through his own actual libertarian free will. He's able to then change the state of affairs in order to create. Now, you might say to yourself, and this is the common objection, right? And I think this is kind of a low-hanging fruit objection that doesn't work. And that is that, well, if the universe had a cause, well, what caused God then? And you hear this from, I think, some of the lesser thoughtful, we'll put it that way, atheists, like Richard Dawkins or something, right? Like, well, who caused God? But that's absurd because in reality, we're not saying that God began to exist. Notice that the argument is everything that begins to exist must have a cause. God does not begin to exist. And the argument that Craig will make through the absurdity of infinity, we're not arguing that God existed in time, in an infinite amount of time. You would have to argue that for the universe, which is an absurdity. And of course, again, through that's more the logical argument. The scientific arguments is that the universe did have a cause, it's expanding, all that sort of thing. It did not always exist as it exists, and even the elements within it, they need some sort of explanation as to why they changed. So in other words, you could say, well, the rudimentary elements of the universe have always existed. You always had that hydrogen atom. You always had, the different atoms floating around, all that sort of thing. But if they infinitely existed that way, they would be floating around infinitely in the same way that they've always been floating around, doing the same things that they've always been doing. What brought about the state of affairs that changed what they were always doing infinitely? We're not just talking about for like a million years, a billion years, a trillion years. We're talking about they've always been, which means, frankly, they should have created numerous universes, not somewhere else, not in a parallel universe. I mean, in our universe, there should be numerous other universes that were created, and they all collide maybe, and then you'll make that the big universe or whatever it may be. But ultimately, there's nothing to suggest that's been happening at all. There was instead these things that seem to have begun to exist, and therefore they are in need of something else. They're in need of a change of a state of affairs from eternity, from infinity. Well, again, you can only have that if you have a personal agent who decides through his free will to actually change the state of affairs in order to create what was not there before. in order to give being out of non-being. And so in reality, what you have is being out of non-being in terms of the universe, but it's being out of being because God is creating it. He's causing it to happen. And that's far more logically consistent than the absurd idea that, well, it just happened. It's just there. It's just, and maybe our thinking is wrong about time. And it's just, all these absurdities are created in order to reject the idea that, well, there's a God and I'm accountable to him. Obviously, if he made the universe, he made it for a reason. There's purpose to it. It flows into all these other things that you have to accept. And a lot of atheists just don't want to accept that. Now, what is the issue with the cosmological argument that I would say is problematic, and I think a lot of people would say is problematic? It's not with the argument itself. It's just the fact that it doesn't get you to the Christian God stated as I just stated it. However, I actually think I can get you to the Christian God given what we've said before. So if, in fact, as is argued by Craig, and I think as I just argued here, God would have to be personal, not some state of affairs. We're not talking about pantheism, which would be you can call it God all you want, and call it universal mind all you want, but it's not really mind. It's more like electricity. It's more like energy that doesn't have a mind to it, because there's no personhood there. It's no thought. There's no purpose. It's just there. So the idea, when you're watching Star Wars, it's like, the Force is kind of putting everything together. It's like, what do you mean it's putting everything together? That assumes that the Force is a mind. It's not. It's just an energy. That's more of a Taoistic view. Or in Hinduism or Buddhism, you have the pantheism that is frankly, it's called, like Brahman is called universal mind, but ultimately he's not a mind. I mean, even saying he is incorrect because it's an it. It's just an energy. It's just existence itself. It's like breath, but without mind in it. It's just like, it's that. It's just kind of if you had life, but no brain in the life. There was no mind in the life, that sort of thing. So to call it mind is I think not correct. So that can't be at the beginning of the universe because, again, that's just a state of affairs. It would always be that way. There would be no change. In fact, Eastern religions teach that our understanding of change is just an illusion. There is no change. It's just this universal energy or whatever. The problem is that you would never get the universe that way. It would never exist. Even what Hindus and Buddhists say is an illusion. That's a change of affairs, a state of affairs. You would never have an illusion come about unless that illusion was eternally within the God itself. And again, that's just not something that you have in those religions. That would be basically that illusion and deception is within the God itself, when the God is supposed to be truth and all that sort of thing. So my point is that it can't just be a pantheistic system. It's got to be a theistic one, and so you have to have a personal God. Well, if you have a personal God, that's when the other arguments come into play, that it would seem then, in an experiential type of argument, that a personal God has made personal beings because he wants relationship with them. That would be the purpose. And a personal God, of course, with the mind, has a purpose. And if he has a purpose and he wants to have a relationship with us, he's going to give us knowledge, and we seem to have knowledge. And that then speaks to the fact that, well, if we're going to have knowledge, we need not only God exists, but also to God communicate to us. We need him to communicate to us through some sort of revelation that is reliable. And that gets us back all the way back to the original argument of, well, that means that it's going to be one of the theistic religions that have a revelation, which is Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and then the derivatives of that. Even Islam's really a derivative. But if you follow the argument I made before in the first lesson, you understand that really just gets us down to Christianity. If you don't understand why that is, then I'd go back to that first lesson and listen to it. And so what this essentially says, along with the other things that I've said, is that this first uncaused cause actually must be the personal God of the Bible, of Christianity, who creates the universe. And therefore, if you take it all together, you could simply make the argument that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This cause would have to be a personal God. He would have to be, again, a personal mind with purpose, an agent with free will who's able to actually change the state of affairs. And this being a personal God, having a purpose with mankind, and therefore man is personal and relational, and he would want a relationship with man because he gives man knowledge, and he'd give man knowledge through revelation, and that would be actually the God who gives a reliable revelation, and it would end up being the God of Christianity. So if the universe exists, if it began to exist as we believe that it does, both through logical argumentation and through scientific evidence, then we would have to conclude not only that some generic God caused the universe, but rather the God of Christianity caused the universe. And therefore, is Christianity true? Yes, it is. And so that's going to be part A of our installment. I'm trying to make these shorter. Otherwise, I'd go into the design argument. And we'll talk more about maybe pantheism there and the refutation, I think, for that in the design argument. But that's essentially, I think, the column argument. Again, if you have an objection, I guarantee Craig has probably dealt with the objection. I would just turn him on YouTube and listen to him. Obviously, we don't agree with Craig in terms of his theology, but that's not where he shines. He's not a biblical scholar. He's not really a systematic theologian. He really is a great philosopher, though. And he can think on his feet. He's a great thinker. I admire him for that reason, even if, if he's not a Calvinist, he's not Reformed. I still appreciate the thinking ability that he has to be thoughtful about things. He's well-versed in philosophy. Every objection I have ever seen, and there are multiple objections. It's not, cookie cutter. Multiple objections, and I have seen him just field them and be like, yeah, I mean, you're reduced to either absurdity or to accept his position. That's really what it is. I mean, you can play with semantics all you want when it comes down to it, but if you're reduced to, I have to believe that the universe began to exist, but there's no cause, well, I mean, okay, well, but then you really are just saying something popped into existence, whether you want to explain it that way or not. You're saying that something came into existence that didn't exist before and nothing caused it. It just is uncaused itself. And yet it began to exist. And so I think that's a complete absurdity. I think it's much better to say, look, you have an uncaused being who never began to exist. He's always existed, and who is personal and changed the state of affairs in order to bring about the existence of something that begins to exist, that is the universe itself. Of course, there's also the other objection that, look, if you have something pop into existence without a cause, why isn't anything else doing that? In fact, there's nothing to restrict it. Ultimately, everything could come into existence without a cause, and everything would come into existence without a cause because, again, nothing's restricting it from doing so. To say that somehow, well, just the universe did that is to ultimately say that, well, it's special pleading, really, because ultimately you're just saying, well, it's just the case in the universe, but it's like, but what's restricting anything else from doing that? And if you say, well, the universe is doing that, the universe is restricting it. So the universe that exists can't bring into being as good as non-existence. I mean, it just ends up being this absolute absurdity where, like, so the universe that exists can't do, you would think it would do more. Like, more things would come to existence with the already existence of a universe or something instead of less. More things would just pop out of nowhere. Why does a bicycle just not pop out of nowhere? Or, you just have a tree floating in the sky. I mean, you just literally have anything in the world that you could possibly think of just coming into existence because there's no need for an explanation. That's an absurdity. So I think, again, just like with the argument from knowledge and logic and all of that, you're reduced to an absurdity. Now, you can go about and say, well, I just believe the absurdity. That's fine. But that's not a rational argument. You're just telling me what you believe. You can believe anything you want, no matter how absurd it is. But it's not rational. So, I mean, you don't have an explanation, you don't have a reason. It's not logical. You're just believing it. We can counter this both within Christianity and outside of it. People just want to believe whatever they want to believe. Yeah, you can do that if you want. But ultimately, I would say, look, is this what you're going to risk your eternity on? Like playing with words and semantics and what you can kind of get away with in like an academic paper or in a classroom, but not in real life, because obviously real life is going to accord with what's true. Are you really going to risk eternity on just playing around with philosophical ideas that are just speculation that, again, don't accord with reality? I just think that that's absurd. I think, look, this should bring you to the idea that, look, there is a personal God who has made the universe. There's a personal God who has made you. He's given you the ability to use logic and knowledge that you might know the nature of reality, because he's a personal God and wants a relationship with you as he's revealed. Along with the nature of reality, that's part of the nature of reality he's revealed, that he wants a relationship with man. He's made man for himself. Man is in rebellion against him because man wants to be God himself, but ultimately he calls us back through the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, paying for that rebellion that we've committed, that we might be forgiven if we ask for forgiveness and be restored to the God who made all things, including us, for himself. Well, I hope that that's helpful. We'll talk about the design argument next time in part B of this. I think it's part 4, part A, and then next time will be part 4, part B. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.